This week on Fridays with Phil, we want to take a look at the destruction of Babylon in chapter 18 of the book of Revelation. In chapter 18, we reach somewhat of a climax in the book where we finally see the destruction of the kingdoms of the earth. And we want to take a look at the question, why is it that the book of Revelation uses the image of Babylon to talk about the kingdoms of the earth? I'm Dr. Phil Mayo, and I'd like to share with you just a few minutes of biblical insight to help you along the way. If you enjoy the content, please be sure to subscribe. For the past 2 weeks, we've taken a look at chapter 17, and I mentioned at that time that chapter 17 and 18, actually through verse 10 of chapter 19, is a focused or sort of a magnified look at the sixth and seventh bowls that are presented to us in chapter 16. In the sixth bowl, we get the Battle of Armageddon, and in the seventh, the destruction of the kingdoms of the earth. In chapter 17, we talked about how the harlot of Babylon, who has on her forehead written the great prostitute, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes. And we talked about how actually in chapter 17 we have an interpretation given to us by the angel of who the prostitute is and who the beast is. This is the first time in the book of Revelation that we actually get an interpretation of an image from a divine being. Unfortunately, as we noted last week, we don't completely understand the interpretation, but this we do understand. It seems almost without a doubt that the woman represents the city of Rome and the beast represents the Roman Empire. And these two images, the prostitute and the beast, kind of morph back and forth between the city itself, called the Great City, and the empire as a whole. We have to remember that this apocalypse is written to the seven churches in Asia. In the first chapter of the book, John is told, write what you see and what you hear and send it to the seven churches in the province of Asia. And then those churches are listed. So for them, these imageries have to mean something for what they're experiencing, and it offers them some kind of hope. The overarching message that comes through this is that the kingdoms of the earth, and the earth dwellers, are those who have given themselves over to Satan and to his emissary, the beast. They've accepted the mark of the beast, therefore that represents that they belong to him, just as the people of God are sealed on their foreheads with the name of God and the Lamb. In chapter 18, we get almost in a poetic format the description of the destruction of Babylon. And we come to the question, why is Babylon used in Revelation for an image of the kingdoms of the earth? Well, there's a lot of history behind this. It goes back to the Old Testament scriptures. In Isaiah and Jeremiah in particular, there are a number of prophecies against the kingdom of Babylon. And a number of these texts are alluded to in chapter 18 of the book of Revelation. You have passages in Isaiah that says, fallen, fallen is Babylon. And of course, this gets repeated again here in Revelation. We first saw this pronouncement by an angel, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, in Revelation chapter 14. And now it's coming back again in more detail in chapter 18. Chapter 50 of Jeremiah, chapter 51, talks about the destruction of Babylon. And a number of phrases are pulled out of that prophetic literature and used here in the book of Revelation, talking about how Babylon will be a haunt for jackals, how it will be destroyed and it will be a wasteland and no one will dwell there again. There are passages in Isaiah, like Isaiah 14, where there's a prophecy against the king of Babylon, but the prophecy almost morphs into a description of perhaps Satan himself. In Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12, listen to this. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. This is a prophecy actually against Babylon, and in particular the king of Babylon. But it sounds like something that maybe Satan at some point said before he was cast down. Remember, Revelation talks about him being cast down in Revelation chapter 12. Notice here, Isaiah 14:12, how you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth. So Babylon, in the early 6th century, in 586, took Jerusalem, and destroyed the temple, and carried away from the temple all of the articles of gold and silver and bronze, all the precious articles, and took them to the capital of the Babylonian Empire. And so Babylon has become equated with that empire that destroyed the temple of God, that destroyed the place where God put his name, and destroyed Jerusalem. And you notice in Revelation how Jerusalem and Mount Zion figure so prominently all the way through, and how Babylon is the metaphor for those kingdoms who stand against God, in particular the Roman Empire. Babylon by the end of the first century has become equated with Rome, because in AD 70 Rome destroys the temple in Jerusalem just like Babylon did. In fact, there's a Jewish apocalyptic work called Fourth Ezra that was probably written around AD 100, so just a few years after the book of Revelation, that talks about Rome metaphorically in terms of Babylon. In fact, the book itself, Fourth Ezra, is a pseudepigraphic work that was written as if it was being written 30 years after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 under the Babylonians, but in fact it's being written 30 years after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And there, Rome is called Babylon, just like it is in the book of Revelation. In fact, if you take a look at the ending of the epistle of 1 Peter, the very last verse, he writes, she who is in Babylon greets you, and he's talking about the church in the city of Rome. So even there, Rome is called Babylon. So this connection with Babylon and its destruction of the holy place in Jerusalem becomes a metaphor for the kingdoms of the earth that oppress the people of God. And the issue here in Revelation chapter 18 is that Babylon is the city that has oppressed God's people. That's the real issue here. We pointed that out in chapter 17, where it talks about the prostitute being drunk with the blood of the saints. Notice here in chapter 18, at the very end of the chapter, verse 24, it says, of all the things that's said about Babylon, its destruction, the final thing that's said about it is, in her was found the blood of the prophets and of God's holy people, of all who have been slaughtered on the earth. This is the real issue with Babylon, is that it is oppressing God's people, and for that, God is going to judge it. In chapter 18, we find three woes that take place that are pronounced on Babylon. Pronounced, first of all, by the kings of the earth, secondly by the merchants, and thirdly by the sea captains. And it's the final, or the next to the final one in verse 16 is, woe, woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. And then there are, after the three woes, three rejoices. Verse 20, rejoice over her, you heavens, rejoice, you people of God, rejoice, apostles and prophets. In chapter 19, we're going to see the final battle where Jesus comes, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, comes on his white horse, as already has been proleptically mentioned in chapter 17, verse 14, to wage war on all of the people who stand against God. And then we're going to see the final destruction of the kingdoms of the earth. And we'll take a look at that next week on Fridays with Will. Won't you join me? Thank you. God bless you.